Every gamer will at some point reach an age in their life when they finally start to accumulate some disposable income of their own and be able to buy all the new releases they please. Unless of course you're spoiled, you git. For me, this didn't come till around about 2004 when I started college and got my first job, so the few years prior to this were quite frustrating. However, whilst most console games were out of my price range, PC games always had something affordable and usually unheard of to offer, and a free for £10 bargain bin at Virgin Megastores got me Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun, Clive Barker's Undying and Summoner, which in retrospect was a bloody good deal. When the game begins, we are introduced to our main protagonist, Patrick Galloway, an Irish World War I veteran who, whilst fighting the Trasanti, encountered a shaman commander who inflicted upon him severe burns, but who, for reasons unknown, left him the pendant that did so. Since then, Patrick has been expanding his knowledge of the occult to the extent that he is now being hired to travel to different locations investigating the existence of the not too normal, and upon returning to Ireland after 6 months, he is presented with a letter from his old commanding officer, Jeremiah, who has requested his assistance. We take control of Patrick as we arrive at Jeremiah's estate, and the first thing you will notice is that this is a first-person shooter where your primary weapon is held in the left hand. Other than dual wielding in a game, I don't think I have seen this before, and I'm not entirely sure I have seen it since. The game takes no time in showing its horror fantasy hand by throwing us in front of a big gothic mansion equipped with a pistol and magic spell. The spell we currently possess is called Scry, which is used to view ethereal entities and as a better means to see in the dark. The beginning of the game is slow paced, setting up the plot and atmosphere. When you enter the estate, you are greeted by a servant who informs you that Jeremiah has become bedridden and that the grounds are in a state of disarray due to the majority of staff being let go. Upon meeting with Jeremiah, you are quick to learn that it is a fatal war wound that has destined him for the grave, and that upon his return home to the manor, his family are all mysteriously missing. I don't think it takes too much brain power to figure out what state they are in, as moments before this we see the ginger lad skinless, brandishing some hooks on chains and floating around the room, but it helps to build the mystery. Your reunion with Jeremiah is rudely interrupted by sounds likened to a lichen, and you make haste to investigate. As you make your way down to the ground floor of the manor, you will encounter a number of locked doors and branching paths, letting you know that this isn't going to be your average point A to point B linear shooter. When you arrive down in the conservatory, you get your first taste of combat in form of howlers, jumpy, fast, scrappy little monsters who shouldn't take more than a bullet in the head to dispose of. Upon returning back to Jeremiah, he spills the beans on what is actually going on. It turns out that when Jeremiah was young, he encountered a small island of sigil carved stones, and rather than ignoring them, he took his siblings and read passages from his father's books on the occult, resulting in a burgeoning curse on the family.
I believe those standing stones had something to do with this.
Jeremiah hands you a scroll and appoints you the mission to awaken the stone's power, and from here you are pretty much left to your own devices. I normally wouldn't focus too much on setting up the plot of a game, however it is worthy of note here as this is, as the title says, a game written by Clive Barker, who, if you don't know who he is, he's a Liverpudlian writer and director probably best known for creating Hellraiser, an incredibly dark and sadomasochistic movie about Cenobites, so to say the game leans heavily on plot and narrative is to be expected. The first portion of the game harps back to the more familiar survival horror genre, having you explore a large, mostly locked off mansion, collecting keys, opening doors and battling jump scare encounters. It does a real good job at setting up the atmosphere, pace and difficulty, which ramps up at a subtle rate. To coincide with the setting, there has been a noticeable amount of effort dedicated to the scale and design of the estate that you roam around in. Every room you enter seems to have been, to some extent, thought out in terms of what it would function as should this be a real residence, and subsequently contains the appropriate amount of furniture or change in design. It was very commonplace back then, especially on the original Unreal Engine, to just have copy and pasted content to bridge small gaps or fill small rooms, and whilst textures and models do repeat all the time, there was enough variety that I never found myself taken out of the environment or getting too lost. Which is a good thing, as the lack of a map could really be an issue should every hallway look the same. As you expand your avenues, you will also expand your arsenal of weapons and spells. Very early on, you will gain the spell Ectoplasm, which shoots streams of unpredictably accurate ethereal bolts, which due to the rate your mana recharges will become your bread and butter through the early portion of the game. Luckily, this is quite a weak attack and doesn't diminish your pistol into redundancy. Quite often, you will exhaust all of your mana just before an enemy closes the distance between you, and it will be down to Old Faithful to finish the job with a bullet. The progression of the plot is mostly told through journal entries that you will find along your way, and it is entirely down to your own discretion whether or not you choose to read these or simply run on by. This is a feature that I always favour. Too much forced dialogue can make you feel like you are not truly in control of your character, and that you are more experiencing the game as the designers had planned, rather than a more unique playthrough. As the story unfurls, so will the locations that you travel to. It is commonplace for a Clive Barker narrative to take a turn to alternative dimensions, and before long your starting ground will become a hub world for crossing over to paranormal lands. This is where the game starts to build on its premise twofold, as along with the more fanciful environments comes unique and bizarre weapons to match, the strangest of which is the war cannon, which resembles a living golden dragon head that infinitely fires giant balls of ice. It's different is what I suppose I'm trying to get at. I don't think I've played a game that stuck so closely to its ideas without conforming to more familiar gameplay tropes. Other than a few boss encounters which feel slightly out of place, you do get the feeling that Patrick is not the main focus of what is going on here, and that the events are occurring despite your presence. However, an interesting story and good setting doesn't detract from the fact that this is still at its core a first-person shooter, and ultimately it will fall down on gameplay to dictate your enjoyment. So let's start with gunplay. I have to admit, when I first played this, I found it rather hard to get to grips with. I think it is mainly because the weapon sits in the left hand, and as a right-handed mouse user, there was something that was slightly off about it. Playing it again though, I didn't have any problems with this, though I do wonder if it would seem odd to another player. Weapons in the game tend to vary in how satisfying they are. The pistol feels ever so slightly delayed and has a bit of a disconnect between firing and the impact on an enemy, and a succession of shots can often be a little unsuccessful. The shotgun on the other hand, excuse the pun, as with most games, packs a satisfying impact and is generally a lot of fun to play with. But most satisfying of all has to be the Scythe. This thing is enormously fun to use and is probably one of the best examples of a first person melee weapon I have ever come across. About halfway through the game there is a turning point where you will find yourself playing the game slightly differently. As your arsenal grows, so will your magic spells, and these come in form of attack spells, personal buffs, and enemy dispels. The earlier stages will have you firing on all cylinders, unloading bullets and spells into the faces of enemies until they drop, but there comes a point where this just isn't as effective as it was. Enemies become quicker and their aim more precise, so avoiding their attacks can prove troublesome. So rather than just hanging back and firing away, it becomes more of a game to get to them as quickly as possible for a quick decapitation. Shield and haste soon become a necessity, and this comes at a slightly annoying payoff. Whilst you can take a few more hits without losing any life, and running at top speed is as fun as it should be, there has been a really odd design choice of making the screen saturated and a little bit blurry, which I could really have done without. In fact, some of the screen distortion in this game can be downright off-putting. Every time one of these slug things spat slime at me, I let out an audible sigh, and the less said about this poison effect, the better. Platforming in the game can also prove to be a bit of a chore. First-person jumping can be a tricky thing to pull off, and it is achieved here with mixed results. Getting the right momentum to land on a small ledge will have you reaching for the quick load key, unless you weren't quick enough to get there before the death animation initiated, in which case you will have to wait for the game to auto-load the checkpoints before you can do anything else. These are only minor gripes however, as I can't let Undying slip by without a recommendation. It is a rare example of trying something different whilst mostly ticking all the right boxes. And for you Clive Barker fans, he even does the voice of this long-haired lad. For the most part, the weapons and magic are satisfying. The skull spell is a personal favourite of mine, being rather charming and humorous. Mix in alternate ammunition for your guns and the ability to upgrade your spells, and you have an arsenal that has a long lifespan. The biggest downfall of Undying, however, is a certain level towards the end of the game. Prior to this, we will have been experiencing a pretty constant build-up of gothic horror with weirder enemies and set pieces to match. This statue in particular surprised me to the point that I made a tiny audible sound. But then we are hit with a pretty uninspired prehistoric setting with annoying plants and boring enemies. This really killed the pace for me. We get a new weapon in form of a spear gun, but it's very lackluster and doesn't look particularly appealing. The enemies in this level also have super accurate aiming and will most likely hit you even if you are moving. I found myself hasting through this section as quickly as I could, which is a real shame. If I had to pick out another fault with Undying, it would be that some of the areas don't reflect the good design of the starting estate. In fact, there were times, especially in the monastery section, where I ran around having no idea where to go or what to do, and that is only made worse if you take a break from playing for a day or two. Undying is a rare specimen that exceeds on the strength of its commitments to its ideas, and it is one that I would definitely recommend if that seems appealing. However, as just a first-person shooter, if you strip back all the set dressing and story, it could be perceived as being simply average. Clive Barker's Undying is available on Steam and on goodoldgames.com, and is often on sale for around about the £2 mark, so if you do fancy checking it out, it shouldn't break the bank too much. Thank you very much for watching, and for those of you that have recently subscribed, I never get a video out quite as quickly as I hope to, but I have some time off work over the Christmas period, and I have a few videos which I've already started making that I hope to get uploaded before the new year.